And hope that we would see a lot of young people, especially because of what I'm about to impart. I'm going to talk about our country, where it's come from, the trails along the way. And some of you know these things that I'm about to talk about. Some of you don't. My wife, Ann, and I just recently returned from a trip to Boston, Massachusetts. And if you've never been there, you need to go. I've been to many of our national historical monuments, and they all have their certain allure. D.C., of course, is on a must-see list with all its monuments. Gettysburg, others. But however, Boston and the surrounding area was the epicenter of this country's march to freedom and independence. To stand at the cemetery where lies Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and so many others who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor is awe-inspiring. There are two walking trails in that city, one called the Freedom Trail. When you take that trail, you'll see the Old North Church where Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott were given the signal so they could take their ride across the country, warning of the British coming. Then there's Boston Harbor, where the original Tea Party took place. And so many other places that you read about in our history books. But then take a stroll down the next trail. It's called the Black Heritage Trail, where people who were enslaved but were yearning to be free, as well as all America, and realizing how many times these two trails, the Freedom Trail and the Black Heritage Trail, cross, intersect, and intermingle. All of it to give birth to our nation. There's a monument on King Street, the site of the Boston Massacre, which occurred March 5th, 1770. It took place a full 5 years before Concord and Lexington, where we're taught that that was a shot heard around the world. But historians believe that the Boston Massacre was the tipping point, but toward our eventual revolution. British soldiers opened fire on an unarmed group of protesters. 5 of them dropped dead. The 5 that died, the first one that died for the cause of freedom, his name was Cyprus Attucks, a freed black slave, the first man to die. Continued down the Black Heritage Trail, where once again it intersects with the Freedom Trail at Fentanyl Hall, where Samuel Adams and others pleaded for their cause of liberty prior to this Revolutionary War. Then less than a century later, men, women, both black and white, like Lloyd Garrison, Lucy Stone, and the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, pled their cause for freedom from slavery. Then make your way to the Boston Common and stand there at the foot of the monument to the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, our nation's first all-black Army unit. If you hadn't watched the movie Glory, check it out. It's the story of the 54th Regiment and the part they played in our Civil War. My own ancestors got caught up in the conflict. They moved here to Texas from Mississippi. My great-granddaddy, Warren Collins, moved with his brothers and their entire family to what's now known as the Big Thicket area, Hardin County. In fact, it's stated that he actually held the survey stake that marked off Hardin County. Grandpa Warren believed, just like Sam Houston, that we shouldn't secede and that slavery was not right. Texas being a Confederate state, all the men of age were expected to join the Confederacy. To that end, a captain by the name of Bullock was dispatched and stationed in Woodville, Texas, and he was to put down any uprising of Union sympathizers and to take into custody anybody that refused to be conscripted into the Confederacy. He surprised my great-granddad and his family, capturing several of them, put them in a stockade at Woodville. They were to be transported up here to Camp Ford in Tyler, and I think everybody's familiar with Camp Ford. It's was the largest Union prisoner of war camp this side of the Mississippi. Well, unbeknownst to his captors, my grandpappy had a knife in his pants, and he began to cut away at the floor at the back of the stockade. Once he got a hole big enough for his men to slip out, he went up to the front. So grandpappy, he was kind of the Bojangles of his time. Anytime anybody played a harmonica, he loved to dance and scoot his boots. And maybe that's why I own my dance hall, huh? That's where I get it from. Got it in my blood. He began to dance up at the front of the stockade as his men slipped out. When they discovered that his men had slipped out and headed to the woods, he slipped out too, hid underneath the stockade until it got dark and went back into the big thicket area. Captain Bullock called for backup. A captain by the name of Kaiser out of the Galveston area came up, and they got to pursuing my granddaddy and his band of Union sympathizers. Had them surrounded in the big thicket. They decided to burn them out, but they left one end of the circle open. My granddaddy and several of them got out. Not all of them did. Some of them perished in the fire, but they set fire to 3,000 acres. And I remember as a kid, the scars that were still there in the big thicket were the Kaiser burnout, and that's what they called it after Captain Kaiser. Well, after the war, my granddaddy managed to elude the capture again, and after the war, he ran across Captain Bullock in Woodville, in downtown Woodville, and the story goes that he cleaned Captain Bullock's plow. So he got even with him, and from then on, they were supposedly friends. Then came January 1st, 1863, when President Lincoln issued what is called the Emancipation Proclamation, which reads, "By virtue of the power for the purpose aforementioned, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of the states are, and henceforth shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and navy authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain freedom of said persons." Understand, this is a proclamation. This was not law. It did not become law until the 13th Amendment, and so forth. This was a proclamation, an executive order. Why do we celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years later here in Texas? Well, this is the reason why. It didn't take place until after the war was over. On June 19th is when we celebrate it here. On June 18th, 1865, 159 years ago, Union General Gordon Granger and 2,000 federal troops arrived on the island of Galveston to take possession of the state and enforce the emancipation of its slaves. On June 19th, standing on the balcony of Galveston's Ashton Villa, Granger read the contents of General Order Number 3, which was the Emancipation Proclamation. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. I'm going to pause for a drink. Is that okay?
Yep.
Thank you for bearing with me. The celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, this end of the Civil War, this end of slavery in the nation, is not just a celebration for black Americans or white Americans, or if you put it in today's vernacular, African Americans or European Americans. It's a celebration for all Americans of all races. Of the over 600,000 lives lost in the Civil War, over half of those were Union soldiers. Of those Union soldiers lost in the war, the vast majority were white men dying for the cause of freedom for another race. So this celebration we call here in Texas Juneteenth needs to be thought of as an unhyphenated American celebration. However, freedom was not so free at that time for the black man. Slavery morphed into discrimination, which manifests itself in so many ways, many too ugly to mention. It would take another century before our nation would address this problem through governmental action. As a young teenager in high school, and like most at that age, my mind was very impressionable. There were great men of that era that left an indelible mark on our nation. One such was a young president by the name of John Kennedy, who spoke to our patriotism when he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Then there was one who spoke to our soul, an humble preacher, who said, "I have a dream that one day a man will be judged by the content of his character, not the color of his skin." That man, of course, was Dr. Martin Luther King. To the shock and detriment of our country, both of those great leaders were lost. Out of that time in history came the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most significant civil rights legislation to come out of the 20th century. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, in the workplace, and in facilities that serve the general public. As a nation, we have struggled from our very beginnings to accomplish freedom for all our citizens. And there still are problems of discrimination and racism. Yes, and there always will be. Why? Because of the sin nature of mankind. But we have come so far in curing a lot of those problems. Today, our nation's top leader, who is referred to as the most powerful man in the world, President Obama, happens to have black skin, but the blood that courses through his veins is half white. So we've come a long way. Politics today and its discourse seems to have drifted away from those immortal words of Dr. King, where we judge by the content of our character. Oh, that we all were blind, so that we could truly see the content of each other's heart and soul. Today there is a shift or a focus to address those obstacles that stand in the way of independence. As many of us see today, as many of us see it today, it means that freedom and self-reliance, independence lies in a cohesive family unit and in an education. To many of our young people that lack the family structure and support, that results in high school dropouts, a high school dropout rate that is just almost too much to bear, and a 50% birth rate of children out of wedlock. This all leads to a downward spiral instead of a steady climb toward success. Many of us have overcome those obstacles. Many of us have overcome those obstacles. I know firsthand of the struggles, for my youngest daughter decided to abandon her education and seek the pleasures of the world. She became pregnant out of wedlock, and the man who was the father of the child she was carrying told her to get an abortion and get out of his life. Those were very harsh words, but thanks to being raised in a strong family with a good Christian upbringing, like the prodigal son, she came home. Our family helped her through her pregnancy, and after her son was born, she took on the burden of being a single parent. The road was rough, but she fought the good fight. Then one day after her son's second birthday, she came to me with a question. Unbeknownst to me, she had been studying all this time, and she said, "Dad, I've been accepted to veterinary college. Should I go?" I said, "Darling, is that a question?" She went about her task, and while my wife and I took care of our grandson, for the most part of 3 years, she was away from home and family. She graduated in the top 10% of her veterinary class, and because of that education, because of that strong family structure, she's now set on a path coming out of the possibility of spiraling into poverty and dependence. 2 weeks ago, we had a man here in Tyler. I don't know how many of you lined up to get his book signed. I didn't get to do that because I happened to be out of town, but I got Angelina, who led our pledge, to stand in line for me with a book. The man I'm referring to is Dr. Benjamin Carson, the former head of pediatric neurosurgery at the renowned Johns Hopkins University. His story of being raised in abject poverty by his single mom, who saw to it that her 2 sons were educated, is awe-inspiring. I encourage you to all read his story, which is recounted in his book, America the Beautiful. In closing, I will leave you with these words of 2 of our greatest presidents. First, that of the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. We are all Americans by birthright and have an indwelling spirit of freedom. It is time for us to emphasize those attributes that unite us, and not those that separate us. Those attributes like the Judeo-Christian beliefs, the family unit as defined by our Christian heritage, that striving for freedom, independence, and self-reliance that does not look to the government for all our needs. Working together, we can truly be what President Reagan said, that shining city on a hill. Thank you for listening to me.